So we're going to get started. I'm the lucky one to get to introduce Craig Dykers, who's the original founding partner, one of the original founding partners of the interdisciplinary design practice, Snøhetta. Snøhetta has employees from 40 different countries in the world, working in offices in Oslo, New York, Paris, Innsbruck, Hong Kong, Adelaide, and San Francisco. They work across disciplines in architecture, landscape architecture, interiors, product design, and graphic design. As a practice that is led in part by Craig, they have received a lot of recognition, too long to list here, but just to name a few: the Mies Prize, the Aga Kahn Award, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award. But with a practice like Snøhetta, one may want to identify inflection points when given an introduction, maybe key moments when they accelerated the growth of their practice. Was it, for example, in 1989 when the original founding partners did a competition shortly after graduating from architecture school and won it for the Great Library of Alexandria? They would get on a plane, fly to Egypt, and come out of the cab with their long hair, and the clients asked them, "When will your bosses arrive?" Or was it when I met Craig in the early 2000s with a small group from their Oslo office who had come to New York to set up an outpost because they had just been selected to design the 9/11 Memorial Museum Pavilion. At the time, a small office working alongside some of architecture's largest practices. This is often their story. Even now, as they have grown, they typically compete and win commissions against much larger practices in the world. But these moments are not really what drives Snøhetta. In fact, as a practice, they are against the myth of singular events and singular voices. They're deeply collaborative, and they're well known for a design culture that is based on building consensus, fostering empathy, and a shared responsibility to climate and society. The moment that defines them is actually many moments, an annual event that occurs in their practice. Each year, for over 30 years now, they fly all their employees, now over 350 people, to Norway, and together they hike a mountain. The name of this mountain is Snøhetta. The journey is more than an exercise of team building. It's a collective act of shared ambition. It's a journey through transformative landscapes. It is a moment of trial, defeat, and discovery. It is a suspension of disbelief. But these words aren't mine. They're actually from Snøhetta's recent book, Collective Intuition. I'm quoting it because this is how they describe their design process. But it could easily be instead a story of a pilgrimage up a mountain. As they themselves say, Snøhetta is a place nobody is from, but anyone can go to. So it's with this form of open-ended welcoming that I invite Craig Dykers to show us some of the mountains, both Snøhetta and otherwise, that they have traveled. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Really, it's a wonderful school to talk to. The program here is very well respected, so I think you all should be happy about your studies. It's quite a respectable building you're in, and amazing people. I met a few of them today. I had a little bit of a walk around the campus, and I had some tips to go on, but the first thing I noticed was this kind of amazing coincidence of this beautiful niche and this amazing football stadium, which I think used to be one of the greatest stadiums probably ever made until they added all the precast concrete and the metal junk on top of it. But it's a pretty cool stadium, and that amazing niche you can see from a distance. And then I turn around and I see the school, and it weirdly looks like a football helmet from this side facing the niche. So, and strangely, I think they're almost identical in scale. Like you could slide the whole of Knowlton right into the football field niche, and it would kind of work perfectly. It was just an observation. I also made a fantastic visit to the cartoon library and museum. It's the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library. So this has been on my bucket list actually for years. And I came here a long time ago and it was closed. And I went to the Wexner instead. But I was actually a cartoonist when I was most of your age. So in my 20s, I drew cartoons and illustrations, and that's one of my illustrations on the right when I was about 20 years old at University of Texas in Austin. And we had all talked about this cartoon library because I was working with people like Sam Hurt. I was doing a lot of illustration. It paid for my architectural education at the time. I don't know if you know Sam Hurt, but like I-Beam and other things like that. So finally I got to go there, and I didn't think I'd get to see it on this trip, and I just found it accidentally in a way because I had a tip to go to that building, Sullivan Hall, and I thought that the library and museum would be somewhere else, and I walked in and there it was, and wow. If you are going to school here and you do not go to the Cartoon Library Museum, you should be ashamed and spend hours there because it's pretty magnificent. It's really an incredible place. And it's, I think, a place where every cartoonist and illustrator wants to go to. It's got a great reputation. Not my first time in Ohio, and interestingly enough, the first project that we ever made was here in Ohio at Bowling Green State University, which is northeast of here. Some of you may know it. It's a very small university. I believe, if I recall correctly, about 80% of the student body were first generation, first time college graduates. So most of them came from agrarian families who worked the land in and around Bowling Green, which is pretty flat. If you've been up there, I guess I used to say, it's so flat that if you look long enough, you can see the back of your head. There's just nothing to get in the way. Remarkably, like, dense flatness. This is a picture of the building. This was our first project in the United States built, which was, thank you, Ohio, for believing in us, because everybody wondered what the heck we were with this weird name that nobody could pronounce. And we were these strange people coming over from Europe, and Bowling Green said, sure, why not? We'll pay you a 2% fee, but it's okay. There's the interior of it. We are named after a mountain, and it is a very special place. It's a very beautiful mountain. If you think you haven't heard of this mountain, you may be wrong, because it's the place in Norse mythology where Valhalla, the great Norse palace, is located. So you've probably mostly heard of Valhalla, and it's located here in this beautiful mountain. We climbed it the first time back in 1989. That's me there in the middle with the cowboy hat and the big beard. And we were pretty young. All of us were about 30 or younger. And we started thinking, well, we can do this. Why not? We were kids. We had no money in the bank. We just had ideas. We did everything we could to make a studio happen across multiple nations. And since then, we've grown to have the offices that Fu mentioned earlier. It's a number of places around the world where each office is sustainable, builds its own context for itself. I'm not going to talk about these projects because these are pretty old, but if you don't know who we are, and this is the first time you've ever heard of this company, this studio, we made the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt, as you can see here on the left, and the National Opera and Ballet in Oslo. We made the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. We've made the plazas at Times Square, and it's a pretty long list of things that we've done, but none of those will be discussed today. But I will talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary quality of our work. We're more than 4 groups working together, but the primary 4 are landscape, architecture, interior architecture, graphic and branding design, and we sit in one big space and work together. And when we do work, we also recognize that it's a broad range of people. We're from, as was mentioned, from a number of different countries, all trying to get along. And everybody has challenges, so I won't lie to you. This is not easy to do all this. We argue, we have challenges every day, but it's worth it. We all feel it's worth it for the greater good of what we're trying to do. We have a pretty broad range of ages. We have about 3/4 of the office is right-handed, and we have a couple of ambidextrous people. So I guess we need to increase that in the studio. We need more ambidextrous people to make it even more diverse. We sit in the big space. We often eat together in the same place where we meet. So our studio is about eating and meeting, which is intriguing. So we often cross over where the meetings and the and the eating happen at the same time. So it's a way of creating a communal kind of character. We call this transpositioning. So it means that we like to take the place of our colleagues in professions we don't ordinarily have confidence in. So an architect can be a landscape architect for a day, or landscape architect can be an architect, so that we share the challenges that each group has. It gives us a better understanding of where we're going as a group. It's different than transdisciplinary, which just in many cases means we've got this group, we got that group, and we got this group, and they do their thing, and every now and then they get together and share their profession. In our world, we're constantly trying to merge the 2 or 3 or 4 worlds together. We're intrigued by the challenges of solving or helping to solve some of the environmental issues that we're faced with today. We're working a lot with carbon neutrality, habitat, and so on, which I'll talk a little more about. This is a chair that we designed, which was created from harvested plastic from the Pacific Ocean. So we didn't design the chair. It's actually just a rather rudimentary middle school chair that you might have in your school when you were growing up. So we just copied it and made it out of garbage. And it was an interesting exercise to see where we could go with materiality. And we have a materials laboratory that we test things in this regard. We like to get physical, which was quite difficult at some times during COVID, but we did make models on Zoom. So we were making things on Zoom and holding them up and trying to see how we could actually continue to make physical objects. I will say this to all of you, it's my general feeling that if you're only thinking with your brain, you're not really thinking. You need to think with your body also. Your brain and your body are the same thing. And if you're only thinking with half of that, you're only going to get half an idea, or you're only going to have half an understanding of something. Your body actually has neural cells in it. Your digestion system has neural cells in it. So you have to move and you have to think simultaneously. That's very important, especially in a profession where we're designing places for people to move within, around, and by. We like to try and create a feeling of humor and lightheartedness in the studio. So we have a little kitchen right up front, and we put a beer tap in it, but made people nervous, so we had to put a fruit bowl out there so it looked like we were a little healthier than we probably are. But we get together, we have things like Thirsty Thursday, and we try to do as much as we can to keep a sort of lighthearted quality, because laughter and humor, which are actually generally despised in our profession. And if you make a joke in a lecture, for example, people are going to think you're not very serious. But we think it is serious. Laughter can be serious. As mentioned, we do get together. We don't actually get together every year. That would be a bit hard. It used to be every year. So for the first 15 years, we were every year. And then when we got bigger, it was like, whoa, all these people. And so now it's sort of every other year. And we can't get all of us there now. We're too big. But we get as many people as we can. It's not because we don't want to bring them all, but there's no place to stay in Snøhetta. So there's a tiny little cabin, and basically we sleep on the floor, and there's only so much floor space. So this is about as many people as we can bring at once. It's intriguing because some of the people maybe come from Hong Kong or somewhere. They've never seen a mountain before. And we're kind of crazy enough that we just say, climb the mountain. We'll see you at the bottom. And they just go and they climb it. We've never had any serious injuries, but we have had a couple of rescues that we've had to make up at the top of the mountain. So yeah, it's a little risky to do that. I would say, oops, I think I hit the wrong button. There it is. These are just a few of the people in our studio in New York and San Francisco. I just thought it's nice to show some of them. They're a good, fun-loving group. They work quite hard. And a lot of the work really is depending on them. We also do a lot of work together with outside agencies. So we've helped develop a group called Pencil, which goes to middle schools in New York City, mainly in Brooklyn. And we invite middle school students into our studio, and we give them a project. Then we show them how they can make that project in the same way you're taught here at university. And then they present to us So they get presentation skills, and they create really interesting kind of ideas. They get to work with in the tool shop, and they make architecture and design. And these are kids from schools that really have very little being offered to them. So it's a way that we like to work to give back. We also do a number of other things. Public color is a project we do a lot, where we just go around and paint walls in schools with a bunch of kids. It's a lot of fun. So there's a lot of that happening, but all of that happening doesn't change the fact that we're kind of in the weirdest, most difficult and challenging time that many generations have had to face. We're looking at issues that are serious related to climate, justice related to racial, ethnic, and gender equalities. We're facing warfare like we haven't seen since I was a little kid, where we had to duck under the table because the Russians were going to bomb us. It's a pretty hard time. And you know, once we get through all that, then there's poverty and hunger and sickness that we've got to deal with. So it's a massive amount of weight that we're all carrying with us at this time. And it's forcing us in many ways, positively in some ways, to look at the world from inside out, to try and question the things that we've understood to be the only way that we can understand them. And it's helped us, I think, give new perspective. The challenge, however, is the other side of that, is that it has built up a sensibility of existential crisis in all of us. And if you're anything like me, you go to bed at night going, holy shit, I'm not waking up tomorrow. It's all over. You know, and even if I do wake up, do I really want to wake up? You know, it's like, it's really hard on all of us. And that is something that we need to be aware of. And almost like a bit of a psychologist speaking now, we can't allow the challenge of having an existential crisis in ourselves and in our communities to stop us from understanding reality. You cannot avoid reality. It's out there. Gravity's out there. All kinds of things are out there, and they're going to keep going whether you decide to recognize them or not. And the beauty of architecture and design and landscape, all of these things that we work with, is that we can actually take reality and try and manage the existential crisis in the best way we know how. Because every little step we take, even if it's small, is improving the world that we live in. That doesn't mean that things that we do don't have harm or create lack of benefit, but at least we're trying to understand them and we grapple with them. Grappling is like wrestling, and if you know Aristotle and Plato and all the great philosophers taught philosophy while they were wrestling. They didn't just talk out loud. They actually had wrestling in gardens while they were speaking about the meaning of life. That's because there's something very crucial about taking on reality that we cannot avoid, or we risk allowing the rest of reality to take over, and our world will be, in a way, implicit in the negative challenge that we've created. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. The first thing is habitat, which is a word you've heard a lot. You probably think you know what it means. I thought I knew what it meant until I read about it a little bit more. But it's the world that is around us. It's often thought of as an ecological world, but it's not entirely ecological. We generally think of it as ecological, and that's because one type of habitat is called biotic habitat. That's the one we most think of. It's about living organisms, plants and animals and microbes and all the things like we're living. So we consider all of those living things habitat, birds flying around in trees, bears climbing up mountains, goats hitting each other, worms going through the soil. That's one kind of habitat, but it is not the only kind of habitat. There's another type which is called abiotic habitat, which are the non-living factors of the world around us. Air, for example, is not alive. Water is not necessarily alive. Soil devoid of any living creatures is not alive. And the things that all of us design, the buildings, the plazas, the rooms, the walls, the floors, the ceilings, all of that is part of abiotic habitat. And the biotic habitat and the abiotic habitat have to live somehow together. They have to cross the street and talk to one another. We can't just segregate the idea, for example, of landscape and architecture and say that, well, we'll get one done and then we'll do the other, or we'll get this done and then we'll surround it with that. The two have to merge. And without that understanding, our capacity to manage issues like climate change drastically is reduced. We started to think about this a long time ago with some really simple ideas. We started to recognize, as many of you have, that bees were dying everywhere, and wow, what's happening with the bee population? Well, a lot of it has to do with chemicals that are used in industrialized bee processes or out in the world of where they forage, even if they're wild bees. There are a number of factors that have contributed to bee deaths, not only in the US, but in the rest of the world. So we thought, why don't we try and make a little bee habitat that's not about harvesting honey? It's just about making a place where bees can hang out, do their thing, make babies, whatever they do inside their little bee world, and nobody's going to go in, gas them with the smoke until they fall dead or get knocked out, and then steal all their honey, and then they wake up again and go like, what just happened? Where's all the babies I just made? And so there was a feeling that maybe at least we could start that idea, and then we thought, well, how are we going to get this to be enjoyed by people, because who wants to have bees around? People are frightened of them. So we made this very attractive looking beehive, which wealthy people would say, wow, I want a Snøhetta beehive on my house. And they would put it up on the top of their house or on their buildings or on the commercial buildings. And it would create this place which actually bees can live for a long time without much interference. About 6 years in a good sized hive like this before it needs cleaning out. So normally bees will occupy a space, and after it gets filled with all their poop and everything, they have to go somewhere else. But if you do clean it out every 5 or 6 years, they can live pretty well. The hives themselves were designed after observations of different types of hiving practices that the bees have, forms that we felt might be attractive to them and not alien, like these sort of big boxes with the lids and everything on them. And we made a very simple entrance. There's 2 entrances because bees need more than 1 entrance, but the main entrance is here. And this one was established on top of a building in Oslo. The second thing we talked about was birds. And it is amazing to me, if you walk around any city or even on this campus, here's in Grand Central Terminal in New York City, you often see birds as ornaments on buildings. There's an amazing bronze bird or some other kind of sculptural bird. But if a real bird nests on a building, it gets shot. It's like, as long as you're made of bronze, it's okay. But if you're an actual bird, we don't want you. And they don't want the birds inside of buildings. They don't want birds nesting on the outside of buildings. You've seen all these needles that everybody sticks everywhere. It's like, we hate birds, but we like to memorialize them in statues. So we created a kind of surface of a wall or a building which would have these sort of habitats for different types of creatures, birds, but also other types of animals could use these sort of small habitations, and they would fit within cinder block walls and make them exciting, because again, you have to sell these ideas to people. If you just say, I want birds in your wall, everybody's going to say no way. But if you put a bird in the wall and then you put like a little one-way mirror and a kid can see in there, then it becomes an educational tool. They get to watch the bird and the nest, and suddenly people think, maybe I'll have one of these in my house. So we created a few prototypes, but what I did want to say was that architects make a lot of birdhouses, and in fact, we've been asked to make one right now. And I can tell you, if you let an architect design a birdhouse for birds, it's going to be crap. The only way that this works is because the landscape architects, who really know what this stuff means, are interfacing with us constantly and saying, well, that Mondrian thing that you want to do, or that Frank Gehry thing, no, it's not, the birds don't like it. So there are specific size holes, specific places where the creatures land. It's all about them, not about us. And that takes a kind of a serious way of thinking when you approach your projects. It can change how you identify with your design. The last thing I wanted to talk about was humans. I would talk a bit about birds and bees and stuff, the birds and the bees. Well, now it's human time. We tend to abstract humans. We tend to say, like, if you think about your work at school, I'm making this building, there's a lobby, it can maybe hold 30 people, and those people can go over here, and there's a toilet over there, and there's a plaza here and a couple of doors. The people continuously remain in our minds as abstract ghosts of humans. But they're not. These are real people, and I spend a lot of time just looking at people and trying to understand the irrationality of what people are and what they do so that our work can better address the weirdness of what it is to be human. Furthermore, objects have consequences. We like to think that if we make something, it's all about what it looks like or what it tells us. But any kind of object that we make, all the way from changing the shape of an atom, which creates an atomic bomb, to building a building in a landscape, those things all have energy and consequential values. And so we need to think about architecture not as simply an object with abstract people in it or humans. We need to think of it as consequential objects that have non-abstract entities, human beings moving through in and around them, together with all the animal and plant life that we're working with. In terms of understanding humans, we like to talk about this little sort of psychological cognitive psychology idea, which is the ABCD thing. I'm sure you can see it on like late night TV somewhere with somebody saying, oh, do the ABCD method, but we're not sure where it comes from exactly, but it talks about the effect of what you do, the behaviors that people have, your ability to understand what you're doing or where you are, and the desire that you have to be a part of something. And we often don't talk about desire unless it's on a date. But desire is everything. It's really what makes us human, is our ability to appreciate through desire where we want to be and what we want to do. So in terms of those things, it means moods and emotions are important, how we interact or socialize, what processing and understanding is all about, and finally, what drives us, because not all of desire is your choice. Some of it's instinct, and some of it is a kind of driven character that you might have from your background as you grew up. So putting those worlds together, we create something that's called environmental ecology, which is not our word. It's a science that many people study much better than we do, but we adapt to it. It's the world of bringing the abiotic and biotic realms together. And that could somehow create design solutions. So the first project I'll actually show you is a redesign of a high-rise building in New York City on 550 Madison Avenue. We made a garden and we refurbished it. You probably know this building. It's by Philip Johnson. It was built in the mid-'80s. It made a big splash when I was in school. So when I was in school, Wexner was just getting built, and this building was getting built. There was a postmodern deconstructivist wave that was taking over university education. So it was an incredibly important building to most of the world. It was on Time magazine's front cover. Philip Johnson had designed this thing that looks kind of vaguely like a Chippendale furniture or something like that. I think I saw a picture of it in your library today. It was a pretty impressive thing, but unfortunately, it was all designed for branding. So it just failed miserably. AT&T built the building, then they had to move out. Sony occupied it, they had to move out, and by the time we arrived, the building had been dead for 3 years. Can you imagine a 60-story office building in Midtown Manhattan with nobody wanting to be in it? Every floor was empty. It was just locked up. And their owner was going to tear it down. They were like, we can't deal with this. And we said, well, from a sustainability point of view, tearing a building like this down and building another one of the same size isn't a good idea. Let's just keep it, fix it, and make it work better. And somehow they agreed. I'm not quite sure how. But you can see that even Philip Johnson himself disliked the lower portions of this building. He said that the area at the base wasn't used, and it became cold and unfriendly over time. So even the original architect was questioning these dark, strange spaces that had been created. The colonnades that then were later developed after the design was built were so hard to use that you had to put a sign that said public space every 15 feet for people to know that this is actually a public space. It's one of those things, like if you have to put a sign that says public space, it's no longer public, and it's not space. This is something else. And then they built this atrium in the back, which also just fell apart. When I was there was still one little shop in the atrium operating, and it died about a month after we started the work, and it was a pizza parlor. And I was saying, in New York, if a pizza parlor can't stay open, you got serious problems. Like, there's something more important going on here than just the design or the architecture. Over the years, the project had a lot of different qualities. It was originally open, so it had an open air at the end. Then they added these kind of crazy Las Vegas lamps because, oh, if we add these lamps, people will come here. You know, it still was as bad as it was before. And then they closed it off at the ends because they thought, well, people weren't coming here because it's weather. People don't like weather, so let's just close it off. None of these worked over several decades. And the other thing that we recognized was that where this building was in Midtown Manhattan had the least amount of green space per worker or per occupant of housing. So there was a limit legislated by New York City government that said you needed at least 3% of the area in your district to be given over to green space. And every district had captured that except for Midtown, which was down at 2.44%. With our project, we proposed, if you make the green space right, it'll actually put it up over the level again. So you'll be the building that drives the new understanding of habitat in Midtown. So here's the original design on the left. It was actually very open. You can see there's a lobby in the middle and 2 open arcades on the side. And then what happened was they closed those in on the side and made them into retail spaces, and they had to build a cultural museum space in the back. I say cultural museum because it was basically a term used by both AT&T and Sony to sell electronics to teenagers. It's not really a museum. It's just like, here, look what we make, buy some. And the teachers would take them there and leave them. So it was just a disaster. When we looked at the project, we knew we had to keep some of the retail, but we created this very, very large garden just behind the main structure. It's extremely large, so to give you any indication, if you've been to New York MoMA, it's 1.5 times the size of the sculpture garden at New York MoMA. So it's significant public space, open at all hours for anyone who wants to visit, immediately to the west of the main building. What it did create was, on the bottom here, you can see how much planted space there was on this site before, about 5%. We increased that to 45% planted area on the site. It's massive. We planted 42 trees. We brought in bike racks. We have a lot of toilets, which I'll talk about. We increased the amount of seating and the amount of public space by large numbers. So this was a place that everybody was ready to just shut down. But we showed, and you'll see how, it is possible to change it into something positive. So the first thing we did was had to address the atrium in the back. We were going to take down all this madness that they had put up there, remove the stupid cultural center. And what we did, because the cultural center was part of the legislation by the city, if you didn't have it, you couldn't have the amount of outdoor space. So we said, hey, wait a minute. Why does a cultural center have to be inside a building? Why can't the landscape be a cultural center? People learn from the landscape. It can be a part of how they enjoy life and how they appreciate the future. So we are the first time in New York City where they managed to switch the definition of cultural center to landscape. And we showed how people can learn from it. Obviously, there has to be some education involved. And we cleared it out and made it fresh, access to fresh air. We had to keep the canopy. We wanted it open to the sky, but that was one negotiation we couldn't win. So there is a glass canopy, but you'll see it doesn't go all the way across, so the rain still comes down, naturally waters the gardens that we've created. We studied the Hudson River cliffs, which are over in New Jersey, where there are similar light conditions. So all of the planting is based on the same kind of light conditions from an area just nearby. And all of that area that you see where the majority of planting is not allowed for people. So although we created all this public space, you can't actually walk or move or occupy the space where the plants are so that they can grow on their own. So although we did provide more space, we've actually then took it away again and gave it back to plants and animals. So it was an interesting exercise of verticality and planning, meeting with one another. I'm not a landscape architect, so I can't really address a lot of these issues, and every time I try to, I just sound like an idiot. So what I can say, though, is there are different sorts of plants. Some are natural to an area, and we often hear that word. Some are naturalized, which means they've been there for so long, people think they're natural, but they're not. And then there are invasive and other types of plant typologies. We did a massive study and created an annual patterning for the planting selection that really took a lot of effort. And we also wanted it to exist without fertilizer and without pesticides. So there's no pesticides at all considered here. The first renderings were pretty, exciting, and we were happy to see them at different times of the year. We're very happy to see this thing go away, which was the atrium kind of weird postmodern half arch that was on the side of Johnson's building. And we started sketching this new, very light, very delicate framework that would hold the glass canopy, which the city required, but wouldn't interfere with the quality of the space, would sort of sit to the side. So here you can see the arch over there and the new design, this T-shape that we made lower. Now that was also an interesting negotiation. I'm sure you'll one day find out that architecture is just about negotiation. That's all you do. You just negotiate with people. And the legislators wanted us to keep the canopy at the same height as the original one, because they said it's historical. It's got to be high, right where the other one was. And the only thing we could think of to change their minds was we said, it was a rainy day, and we said, we want you to go outside today, take your umbrella, hold it over your head, and you'll be dry. Then take your umbrella and hold it really high over your head, and you won't be dry anymore. So the lower the umbrella, the drier you'll be, and that got them into this agreement that we could drop the canopy level. So that was a kind of an interesting negotiation. The other thing was that the existing building had an area which was originally open to the sky, it was open to the air rather, a giant 60-foot high space, but later they came in and filled it with mechanical infrastructure. So all of that blue area there was filled with mechanical equipment. And we wanted to bring that back too, so we'd get the height back. We created a direct outside air system, which meant we had a more environmentally friendly air conditioning and ventilation system for the building, and it meant also we could remove all that equipment so that we could, once again, bring all of that space back up to the way it was originally, adjacent to this garden. So here's some of the initial ideas. Here you can see it again in relation to where it was, where we took it. It also meant we could open up the side of the garden so you could see it from Madison Avenue. It goes between 55th and 56th Street. Unfortunately, just down the street from the Trump Tower, so that's kind of exciting. We thought it would be intriguing if you were walking down Madison Avenue to be able to see into the space, to draw people to it. And in the day, it would have a different experience than at night. And so now we finished it. So it was opened a couple of months ago. It's in winter kind of mode, so it's a little dry at the moment, but this is just at the end of spring. It was filled with life, and people were already using it. They're still using it even during the coldest days. So although everyone said nobody would go there, they do. They're protected. There's a bunch of nice kiosks. You can get some good coffee and some ramen soup, and people sit around in the various chairs and seating areas. There's a little waterfall, which does not have water running continuously. And by the way, all the water is captured from the canopy and sent down those columns and then held in a tank. So the waterfall itself can be run sustainably. But it never has a lot of water. It only has tiny little spots where the water sort of comes out. Makes just enough noise to get rid of the car honking that you hear often in the center of the city. The circular geometry was very important to us because it was built into Philip Johnson's original design. So that led to a lot of the detail thinking about some of the seating areas and the planting and vegetation areas. So there's scoops and scallops and sort of taking apart the Platonic geometry while not losing it altogether. This particular seat is very popular. And it does have the rocks. We wanted it to be a fire, but city wouldn't allow fires. So we have steam that comes up. So those rocks with a little red light, so it looks like a fire. But the most important thing is when you sit on the bench on the cold weather, it's heated and nobody knows. So it's so funny to watch people, they'll like sit down and their butt starts to get warm and they're like, whoa, I'm getting warm. And it's like those car seats that heat, except it's outside. As far as we know, it's the first sort of outdoor heated bench in the city. So now that the word's out, people go there just to warm their tush on a cold day. As you see across some of the annuals, so some of the planting is more normal. It's pretty plants that we know will attract people as opposed to the more dense vegetation on the cliffs. And they're sometimes having seating surrounding them. And that's the coffee shop there on the upper left with that strange prow. There's the fountain. And we did a lot of studies about how the water could make the most noise with the least amount of water. And as you look through those new vast tall spaces that we created after we took the mechanical systems out, you look off to the gardens. The aggregate that we used in the precast is we had to dig up some of the stone and we had to use some of the stone off the building that would never get replaced. So we crushed up the stone that we captured from waste and then from the building and put it in to the precast. So it's a little bit of pink granite, which is pretty remarkable. Ultimately, it's coming to the spot where when we first planted it, I was seeing dragonflies. There were some worms I saw. There were some ladybugs. 7 spotted ladybugs have returned to New York City, and I saw one there. There's some beautiful changes in the landscape over the time that I've seen it. So it will be pretty intriguing. By the way, I put in the creatures that are sort of natural-ish, but we also have to watch out for all the invasive creatures. There's an invasive jumping worm. There's a weird, lanternfly. There's all kinds of stuff that we have to watch out for. So that's one of the challenges of making habitat is where do you draw the line between what should be there and what's kind of crashing the party. The last thing I want to say about this project is looking at the connection that you used to have. When the building was built, you could walk down Madison Avenue, and if you looked through those giant arcades, you could see the atrium in the back. But over time, that was taken away because they filled it in with retail. So it went sort of from into a different sort of design, and then there was a lobby that was created. So in the original scheme, you could look all the way through these arcades from Madison Avenue, so you were always aware of that atrium. But it was taken over by retail, and then the lobby became this kind of weird, strange cork for a blockage. So you could never see anymore from Madison Avenue. So you'll see the elevators were a big part of the problem. The fact that the only way you could see through the lobby, there was a set of elevators there. So we decided in this project to rotate the elevators 90 degrees. And believe me, when you tell a developer that you want to rotate elevators 90 degrees, they freak out. So there was a lot of freak out. But we told them how much they would gain from that. And so by rotating them, you get a view right through from Madison, and it would attract people to their building. So the original design when we arrived was this. And I'm not saying this is bad. I mean, look at this beautiful craftsmanship. This is a remarkable work. Those were solid bronze doors and solid granite columns. But it was dark and heavy, and I felt like whenever I went in there, I felt like I should be confessing or something. I don't know. It's like I did clearly something wrong. And so we rotated the elevators, and this is the same view of the same location. So you can see we also made the elevators larger and they're faster, and we created a new garden access from the lobby. So it's remarkable to think. I know it's hard to believe, but it's absolutely true. These are 2 images from almost the same spot in the same building. So it just created this sort of magnet to the garden in the back. And from the outside, we imagined in this rendering that you'd be able to see it. It's reasonably well seen from the outside, and then likewise looking back from the garden to Madison Avenue, it's intriguing. The last thing about this project I want to mention is we're very proud of this. So if we're talking about human habitat, we have created the largest set of gender-neutral public toilets in New York City. So there's actually, I think, 10. We originally only thought we would have 7. And they're free. You can go there anytime. And when you get my age, you're looking for toilets all the time. So it's fantastic. And there just aren't a lot of toilets freely available in New York City. And this one is not only freely available, and it's really good looking, it's gender neutral. And so we think that's kind of another sort of pushing the bar a little bit with the work. So being a practitioner in some people's minds sounds like you're adding to the problem. But we sort of feel that if you do little things along the way, you can help create positive solutions. The next project I'm going to talk about, we just recently were commissioned for. It's to build the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in Medora, North Dakota. This will be the first presidential library for a dead president ever built in this country. And believe me, having a dead president as a client is definitely preferable over having a living president. So, it gives us a way to sort of open a lot of doors. If those of you that don't know Theodore Roosevelt's history, he was actually a rather shy, somewhat sickly young adult. He was a little dashing and sort of bon vivant. He was married to a wonderful woman named Alice, and he had a mother that was very caring named Martha. And on one day, I think it was 1884, on Valentine's Day of old days, both his wife and his mother died of two separate diseases on the same day. So it must have been a shock for him. He went into complete despair. He was in a dark place. He was very close to both his mother and his wife. So it was very hard on him. And he was sickly at the time. They think he might have had asthma or something. So he was sitting in his dark sort of corners of his life when some of his friends said to him, "We've got to break the spell. You've got to get out of New York City. You have to do something else or you're just going to, die of loneliness." So they told him to go, of all places. Oh, by the way, this is the journal. On the day that both his wife and mother died, that's what he wrote in his journal. It's just this big X. And look how serious that X is drawn. Really hard. And it says, "The light has gone out of my life." So they told him, go to North Dakota, of all places. There were people out there in North Dakota. They said, if any place will get you out of all of this, North Dakota will. There had just been built a transcontinental railroad that went through North Dakota, and there was a few small houses in a place called Medora. So he went out there in the middle of the night. It was actually the day after the first presidential train came on the same line, and he chose not to be on that same train. He was just too despondent. And he arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning, dragged his bag through hell in the middle of the night in North Dakota to some silly building, which was where he was going to sleep. And he woke up the next morning and he started to make himself new. And he met farmers and ranchers, and he built a little farm, and a little ranch for himself. He got his health back. He started working harder. He just became more active. He got rid of whatever they believe it was asthma. He was able to beat that. And he put on weight, and he gained a whole new attitude on life. And he created the so-called Teddy Roosevelt that we know today while he was there in North Dakota. Now, that's a pretty fascinating story. But if any of you out there are socially conscious or interested in history and its negative sides, you will immediately be saying, yeah, but Roosevelt, he was a racist. He shot birds on the Amazon. He did all these terrible things. I will not argue that. He definitely had a bad side to him. There's no question. So that's not what's intriguing here for me. What's intriguing is that with a president like this, who's so well known, and he's dead, we're able to pull out all of the things that were about his life, both positive and negative. And also, I want to tell you that many of the negative things that we feel about previous historical characters are actually not accurate. So the greatest example of that is when we were working with Roosevelt's legacy. There was this tremendous statue in front of the Natural History Museum in New York. I had seen it back in the 70s, and I walked past it and went, wait a minute, did I just see that? What is that? And it was Roosevelt, and next to him are a black and a brown men standing there like slaves looking up at Roosevelt, and it's an incredibly racist statue. And everyone said, well, Roosevelt was a racist, so that's why he had that statue. But what most people don't recognize is that statue was made nearly 40 years after he died, in the late 1930s, by a racist director of the museum who wanted to turn the Museum of Natural History into a place where you could prove that races were inferior. And he used Roosevelt's legacy to make that statue, and he never asked the family if they would be involved. They tried to stop it. And there was just no actual relation between this director and that statue and Theodore Roosevelt. But most of us align that statue with the problems that he had. So I'm not saying he didn't have problems, but he also had a lot of intriguing sides to him that were quite different. For example, this is John Lynch, Republican senator from Mississippi, back when Republicans were the progressive party in the country. And John Lynch was the first black man to lead a national convention of a political party in the United States. It was a Republican convention in Chicago back in the 1880s, I guess 1889. Theodore Roosevelt was his biggest supporter, And he pushed really hard to get everyone to agree that this man could lead a national political convention, and he did. And after he did that, he went on to be a Navy commander and became well respected in Washington, D.C. Now, that's not setting aside the other problems he had with racial issues, but it's complex, and he did that. The other thing was, he was shooting birds in the Amazon, meanwhile meeting with John Muir and figuring out how to create conservation movements. So he created the conservation movement in the world. The first national parks came from this person. He set up some of the most important laws to protect bird life and all of that. So to me, that's what's interesting. Nobody's perfect, and this person was far from perfect. But they have a lot of sides, and we can learn from those sides and look at ourselves with a new light. So this project came to us by way of a competition. It was set out in the Badlands, which you may have heard of, which is where Medora is. It's really beautiful. It has lots of people that live in the surrounding areas, and normal people who run candy shops and saloons and things. It's beautifully quiet at times, and it has a range of different types of leisure and activities related to moving through the landscape. And of course, it's an important region to the tribal nations of the area, of which there are many. The Mandan and the Hidatsa and mostly the Sioux tribal groups live in this area. Standing Rock Sioux, for example, you've probably heard of, regarding the pipeline challenges they've had on their property. They all live here. We've been meeting with them, so we have set up regular meetings through the government agencies to meet with their elders, to hear about their concerns, to hear about what they're interested in, to try and create a common ground. They've been very interesting, and you always learn something new when you talk to these groups of people. So the first thing they said when we sat down was like, why are you making a building for like a person? It's a waste of time. You know, it's a person, so what? You don't need to make a building. It was like, yeah, you're right, but we're making it. So then they said, well, what can we do to incorporate our thinking with yours? And they have a long lodge they want to build, so we're gonna help them build, support their work in building their own architecture on the site. And of course, they want more people to go to their places where they live because they need money. So it's a part of an economic foundation for them. So we've found a good place, and it's moving forward, but it's also a challenge with many of these projects. One of the things that was amazing about Theodore Roosevelt was he read like there was no tomorrow. These are some of the books that were on his bookshelf when he died, and these were only a portion of all the books that he read. I looked through this list, and I found only 2 books that I have that he also had, just reading all the time. And so we began to discuss, what does that mean to read? And we're making a library, but we once again turned to the landscape. And we realized that you can read history through the landscape. And so we turned the idea of making a building for a library into making it the landscape as the library. So there are 2 things working together. The site is up on this kind of mesa, or as they call it, butte, I think in the north. I call it a mesa. My father's from New Mexico. I never get the 2 straight, but they're very similar. I always joke like it's a bunch of buttes making mesas all over the place. But there is a sort of flat top with a parking lot that's related to an amphitheater nearby. And there's the town of Medora just off to the right. There are 30 people that live in Medora full time. So it's a 30-person population. And about 200 live there when there are tourists coming in. So the first idea that the organizers had was to put the site on the middle of the mesa, right on the top where you see it right when you come up to the site. And when we looked at that, we thought, no, that's the wrong place. Let's just shift it out of the way. You shouldn't have to see the building. It should be kind of invisible because the reality is all the parking is going to take up a lot of space. And if you move it, you can use the existing parking. And so what the original site location meant to us was this. You put a building right in the middle of this beautiful mesa, and there's nothing left for you to enjoy. Our siting of the building put it off to the right here so that you would see this when you arrive. You'd have an unbroken view of the landscape, and then you'd turn and you'd see the library. So in that sense, there was a kind of sensible location off to the edge of the cliff, and we would create a kind of looping walkway around the mesa. Also, from that location, you could look down into the Little Missouri Valley and see the railway where Roosevelt actually disembarked from, and the area where the first national park in the world was created, the Theodore Roosevelt National Park, just across the valley. And I did spend a lot of time there, so I'm a little bit odd in the sense that I love to walk on my own. I guess I have just too much stuff in my life, so when I can get out on my own, I take it. And I'll walk 30, 40 miles a week or more with just what's on my back. And I did that in the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I walked through the Badlands, which they're called Badlands for a reason. They're bad. There's no good water there. They're really hard to move through. The Indian tribal nations avoided the Badlands, so to walk across it is kind of nuts. But I did. That's my little tent, and I did about three trips across the Badlands. And on one of the trips, I found some pebbles and a leaf that just struck me as interesting. The pebbles were smooth, and not very much is smooth there, and the leaf was just real pretty, sitting alone on the red landscape. And I picked them up and thought about it, and we talked with our team. And we sort of considered, wow, the program, these objects make sense because the program could easily be split into the library and the community center, and the roof could kind of contain them both. So the leaf would put over the two pebbles, and it created the theme for the idea. We went through several sketches, and we also realized that this form of this leaf could relate to the silhouette of the Badlands beyond, because everything in this area is about silhouettes. And so this was our first study model that we made from the leaf and the two pebbles. It's no bigger than a 3x5 card. And it took about, 20 minutes, if that, to make. And we held it and we all looked at it and we said, yeah, this feels right. We split the program into the two components, as we said. We made an outdoor passageway leading up to the edge of the mesa. And it fell quite simply and easily into basic program elements. And although the building looks very organic, you can see it's quite simple in terms of its layout, so the museum can change over time. There are a number of views that we've created from within the building to the exterior to connect you all the time between inside and out. We studied wind, which, as you can imagine, the wind on top of that mesa really howls. I mean, when I was out camping, there were a few times where I nearly got blown out of my tent. So it can get extreme, so we had to organize the building in such a way that it could help block the wind. And there you can see it situated against this outdoor loop that we'll talk about. The roof is accessible, so you can see we've created a ramping system that gets you to the top of the roof and a boardwalk that runs around the prairie itself. So as you approach the site, you'll see this, and you'll see little people up there on top. So you can climb up to the top of the building. It's also wheelchair accessible, so one side has a long ramp, and the other side is not wheelchair accessible. It's much steeper. And it's possible to enjoy the landscape both from at the ground and at the high point. It's about 40 feet up in the air, this high point, so it's not particularly tall. This is the passageway separating the community center and the presidential library. As you move through it, you're able to see the edge of the bluff and out to the surroundings. There's a patio there that looks off to the park. We have some rocking chairs there because it's just great to rock on a rocking chair, so why not? And Roosevelt used a lot of rocking chairs. From the little wash that's adjacent to it, you're able to see up, and the building sort of peers up over the trees inside the wash. And at the top of the building on the roof, you get a commanding view of all of the Badlands. So that'll be a very popular place, I'm sure, for weddings. But even more importantly, it's one of the best sky gazing areas in the country. So there's very little artificial light. And we're controlling. So we had to do this for the rendering, but there won't be that much light coming out of the building. But the client wanted to see where the rooms were, so we kind of lit them up. But it's a great place to see the sky. The loop itself, which is on the ground, is pretty spectacular. It's nearly a mile in length. Anybody can go. It's free of charge. And the idea was for this loop to cut through the history of the landscape somehow. So what we decided on was to look at the terrain as it naturally existed and see how this walkway could expose the history that existed here. So we decided to keep the walkway absolutely flat, even though the terrain moves. So there's times when you're in the ground and your eye is right at the level of the grass, and other times where you're floating over the ground, just so that we can have this kind of timeline expression as you move around it. So this would be a more sort of ordinary place where it's just slightly above the ground. Here's where, and again, these are the same level as the previous image, but it's had to cut into the earth to keep going. And so it'll be interesting because your eyes will be sort of looking through the grass like a rabbit or something. And then other times where there's a bridge going over a little wash or something like that. Along the way, we have lots of moments, places where people can stop and enjoy themselves in this loop, overlooking, again, different types of landscape in the Badlands. We created a series of very rough models. Again, we just went out, walked around, picked up rocks and stuff, and made models just of what we found on the site. One of my favorite ones is this one, which was an old piece of cottonwood tree bark. And we took it back to the studio and carved this little seating area, which we wanted to be a sky gazing area. Originally it had a fire in the middle of it, but that's not good for looking at the stars. So we changed it, and we have now like a stone in the middle. So this is like a place you just go and you lean back. It's not going to be heated, and and when you're there, you're not aware of the earth. You're only aware of the sky. So it's a sort of portal to the gods. The stone in the middle we're going to polish. So we'll polish it so much that you'll see the stars reflected in it at night. So when you look down, it'll be like looking into a pool of stars. We've made another one called a glyph, which is a combination of various languages that were important in the history of the area. And you can move out on that and sort of hang out over the edge. It's mainly a wood structure. We're making picnic areas and places for families. Some of the earth that we have to move for the basements, we're going to turn into berms for the parking areas, so they'll contain the parking areas. The last thing I want to say about this project is that you'd be surprised to learn that North Dakota is actually very progressive. And the governor there, who is a Republican, came out and stated last year that North Dakota will be the first carbon neutral U.S. state by 2030, the very first one to make that claim. And he's pushing really hard to make sure that it happens. He also created the platform there for the pharmaceutical industry to create the mRNA basis for the COVID vaccine. So 80% of the mRNA used in the COVID vaccine in the rest of the world is made in North Dakota. So really interesting, and not at all what you'd expect, because generally South Dakota takes up all the airtime, where they're like trying to kill you if you're not heterosexual or something, I don't know. So it's a kind of weird tolerance between these two places, but they are very different. The general impression that we've decided on with the governor and his help is to create a living building challenge for this building, where we're working on really going well beyond the normal platforms that you use to create environmental sensitivity. But one of the first things that we looked at was the ground. And again, this was the landscape architects that came in and said, well, yeah, you can do all that stuff with the wood and the timber and make sure your material resources and your energy uses are minimal. But the earth that this thing is sitting within actually has a huge capacity to manage climate. So it turns out, and I didn't know this, but if you were able to create the prairies as they existed in the United States at one time before it was colonized, from Mexico all the way up to Canada, even in just small areas, if you're not able to have the whole thing return to its natural grasslands, you can create a larger carbon sink than even the Amazon rainforest, which is just astonishing to me. And that's because these plants have deep roots. They carpet the place, so they're everywhere. And they take carbon from the atmosphere, move it into the earth, and then the soil adjusts the kind of combination of its salinity and alkalinity to absorb the carbon. A lot of people are talking about this. Even The Atlantic, which is a pretty conservative magazine, said that preserving the world's great expanses of grass could be essential to combating climate change. And so we're hoping that this project can be a representative of that way of thinking that most people don't understand. These are my sketches, so when I went out there, I was just fascinated by everything that was growing out there. Beautiful flowers, and a lot of juniper, which, by the way, are not native to the Badlands. They were brought there. So we wanted to get rid of them, but it's kind of hard to dig them up, and their roots make it hard for grasses to grow. So we said we wanted to have a controlled fire to burn them. And everybody's like, no, you can't do a controlled fire. Absolutely not. And I swear to you, this had nothing to do with us. 3 weeks later, some lightning struck the site, and the whole damn place burned down. It was like unbelievable fire. It burned all those juniper trees. It killed off all of the non-native landscape that was there. It was like a gift from God. I couldn't believe it. So immediately we started going out and doing seed collections. So a lot of the team are going through the landscape collecting seeds that are related naturally to the area or are useful to planting in the prairie grasses that are needed to re-pollinate the site. And so there's been a lot of trips, and they bring the stuff back on several of these trips, both to laboratories. They separate the seeds to different typologies. Again, I'm not a landscape architect, so I'm way outside of my range here, but it's pretty fascinating how they're able to understand the typologies through the seeds. They collect them at their cars where they're parked, and then some of them we bring back to our studio. So that's our studio in New York. It's a bit funny when the landscape architects have all these weird bottles with strange soil inside of them, but they seem to know what it is. So that's kind of intriguing. The other thing to suggest is that this can't just be about prairie grass. If it's only about prairie grass, we're dead, because nobody's going to say, oh yeah, just grow the prairie grass and we'll be fine. We'll take our cows to somewhere else, because there's a lot of cattle out there, and there's a lot of bison also. And now one of the largest bison herds is out in this region. And by the way, it is a bison. So for those of you that think it's a buffalo, it's not. It's apparently a bison, which is similar to a buffalo, but the only buffaloes remaining in the world, I think, are in Asia, maybe in Africa. So bison are actually 98% genetically a cow. So they're like a cow in disguise. They were bred with cattle. They also bred with cattle long before humans. So they've always been a separate species than a buffalo. And this area has to be grazed. So we're working with ranchers to show how you can build the prairie grasses and the natural grasses into the site. And we're using all that space in the middle of this loop. And we've got the ranchers to agree to bring some of their cattle over and test out different grazing practices that will protect the grass that would naturally be there, and they don't have to buy other grasses or other hays or other food for their cattle. And we'll also bring in buffalo to see how it will happen. So this is a work in progress. We won't know for years what will happen, but it's definitely about regenerative land management. It's about stormwater management on site. We're collecting as much water as we can, and also allowing for as much water as we can leave the site to get to the Little Missouri River and into the washes that are nearby. Carbon sequestration is being built on 2 platforms, both landscape and architecture. So that's a constant process in the studio. Water measurement across the site is a valuable tool for building an environmentally friendly project. It's not enough just to collect stuff off a building and stick it in a tank. It has to be a part of an entire understanding of the site. Waste is being dealt with in interesting ways. We're reusing as much waste as we can, moving dirt around so whatever cut we have becomes fill that's useful. And finally, we're creating as much energy on the site that we're actually going to give energy back to the grid, which is quite intriguing because the area is surrounded by oil wells. So, there's a lot of oil well people who are going, why do we want solar energy? It doesn't make any sense. But we're talking to them about how it supplements what they're doing and trying to find ways to get them to speak on an even playing field so it's not arguing all the time. And we've had pretty good luck so far. And then the last thing on this project I wanted to show is this fantastic drawing that our landscape architects made. It's a kaleidoscope calendar. So at the top is January, and you'll see there's like pie shapes all the way around. Each one is a month, so January, February, March, all the way around. And so if you follow the calendar around the outside, you'll see landscapes. Those are what the landscape looks like at that time of year. And if you set yourself in the middle in the library and you draw a straight line out from the center all the way to whatever day you want to look at, like May 15th, you'll cross a bunch of lines. Each of those lines represents either a biotic or abiotic condition on the site. Some of it has to do with humans. So let's just say you're having a big festival, music festival at the TR Library, lots of banjos. And everybody comes there, and it just so happens they want to have that on April 15th. You can go through and check that it's grouse mating season at that time. So you don't want to inflict harm on the grouse who are just trying to have fun and make babies with your music stuff. So we're trying to allow this thing to rotate so that you can get human activity to occur in the right positions in time so that natural activity won't be challenged. Another little project that's similar is down in Texas. If any of you have been to Austin, Texas, it's characterized by 2 fairly iconic buildings. One is the Texas State Capitol that they love to say is bigger than the US Capitol, because that's what they do in Texas. Everything's bigger. And then the other one is the UT Tower, which is the administration tower, which is a beautiful building by Paul Philip Cray, a great architect. And those two things kind of give the identity to the city, besides the music. And the project that we have is situated at inside that ellipse at the axis linkage between where the Texas Capitol is and where the university grid system and tower is. And they come together in this just slightly, it's very obtuse angle, but it's fairly clear when you're there. And so those axes had been developed over the years, and one landscape architect, I won't mention names, came in and said, oh, well, let's just put some trees on the different axes, because that's what you do. There's axes, and the trees just help you see the axes. But what they did was they just actually made it harder to see the axes and harder to see what was happening. So people were coming there, and they didn't know where the door was, because the tree canopy was too low. In addition, they just built this Ellsworth Kelly sculpture. It's Ellsworth Kelly's last sculpture before he died. So it's an amazingly important piece of art there in this location. And then if you turn around the other way and look back, you see the Capitol in the other direction. And those are pretty powerful views. And we wanted to create the same quality that the original landscape had without creating disorientation. So this is after some of the trees had to get removed. So this is only half the trees that were there. They weren't just killed, they replanted them elsewhere. And so we had to think about how we can create the same kind of shade and make it more easy to understand. There's the Ellsworth Kelly scene from the Capitol building with the two museum buildings on either side. So this museum is split into two. So each of those buildings is a museum. And what's worse is that the university administration wanted everything to look the same, Spanish colonial revival. So you don't know that this is a classroom or a museum. It could be anything. And so nobody even knew it was a museum. There was nothing to mark it. So we developed a very engaging landscape plan that moves people through the site in new ways and creates new shading patterns through objects. So we developed this shading pedal, which you can see on the right, which is very, very large. It's about 20 feet wide and about 35 feet tall. And they don't actually touch, but when they sit next to each other, they create this arch, which is very classic in the University of Texas Spanish colonial revival architectural thinking. So it's an implied arch. It also works with the Ellsworth Kelly arch that's there. And then we created a number of models that showed how you might move in a more organic way and how these new petals might actually create intriguing shade conditions on the site. We decided not to make them solid because we wanted the light to dapple. So these are some little study models we made in the studio with the filigree, and you can see how the shadows began to change. We also ran solar tests, and we did some temperature gauge tests, and we find that these new constructions, we call them petals, are dropping the ambient temperature by several degrees and creating enough shade that people feel comfortable being there, even on a warm day. So these became quite vital to providing comfort and orienting people on the site. We made full-scale mock-ups, which were just insane. We took them to the top of somebody's apartment building and tested the size of the holes. Because if you don't know it, but you can always check one day on a sunny day, go outside, look at the sun, look at a shadow. Shadows are not sharp like they show on the computer's screens, which are all sharp. Shadows are always vague because the sunlight has to go through the atmosphere. Computers don't have an atmosphere. So they're much sharper. So we wanted to kind of capture that. We then built a full-scale mock-up on site of one of these things. And we made several petals with different size holes that we could see what would happen on the ground. It was pretty remarkable. And then they started building them. So these are some of the petals, pieces that were coming in. They're really quite beautiful. They all fit together like a daisy, or a petunia sort of pattern. They build the Capitol on the ground. So first they build the column, then they build the Capitol, and then they lift it and put it in place. And here you can see the kind of quality of the shadow that you get. That's not a bad picture. That's actually the way it is. And some of the circles seem gray. That's because they're slightly smaller in aperture, and some seem much brighter, and they get fuzzy all over the place. So it's like seeing the light coming through tree leaves. We built the first one about 2 months ago, and that started us thinking about what they were going to be like in the end. I'll show you a few pictures, but before I show you the end result, or where we are today, there was this terrible experience of leaving the parking garage and not being able to get to the building. Nobody knew where to go. That was the only parking garage. So this was the entrance to the museum, right? There's not even a place for a person to walk. You had to go around the, the little boom thing. And then when you crossed, you saw that, which was the loading dock. That's the back side of the museum. And if you wanted to walk along the edge of this wall, the university created a bunch of walls around it so that if there was a protest, the protesters wouldn't be able to get into the campus, sort of anti-warfare. They also, by the way, made all the sidewalks exposed aggregate because the hippies in the 70s didn't wear shoes and they wanted them to be uncomfortable not wearing shoes. It was like amazing stuff that people think about in their spare time. But anyway, you would walk along this huge road to try and find the door, and when you got to the actual plaza where the trees were planted, you still didn't know where to go. Who knows where the entrance is in this image? It was just impossible to see. And so they had to put signs up everywhere, like, are you looking for a museum? Go over here. That's why it's like the public space thing. If you have to put a sign, it's kind of a failure. And that was the door you eventually ended up in. So we made a new set of walkways that run along the edge, which was a place that had been forgotten about, a new porte-cochere and a new shade area. So this was how this space was when we arrived. It's right next to that big highway street, and nobody ever used it, although there were lots of rat traps. So we thought, we'll open it up. So now when you leave the parking garage, we were putting a new hole in the parking garage so you can walk out of it. And you move and meander through these beautiful live oak and Spanish oak trees that have been there for decades. And we, by the way, every foundation point had to be tested against the tree roots. So the reason it moves in the way it does is to avoid the tree roots. And then you emerge through one of the portals of the older building into this space, and you're immediately shown the door, which we've created a new door, and you walk under these pedals. They can have events out there. There's the ticketing area on the right. And then when you leave the ticketing area, the galleries are actually in the other building, so you only buy your ticket there, and then you have to cross. And there's this other upside down arch, which draws your eye over with an amphitheater in it. And we're also working to put in Carmen Herrera's last painting before she died. So we have two works by two great artists who made their last work and then died. And that's going on this mural that you see along the arcade. And there's the entrance to the galleries with this weird kind of amphitheater. And we're actually building that now. That's one piece of glass. It's a solid piece of steel that was hoisted up in place. They said they couldn't do it, and we said, well, it's Texas. You got to be able to do it. And they felt embarrassed, so they found a way to do it. It's pretty spectacular. You walk under this great belly of the beast, and as you see it from a distance, and that's looking inside. We haven't finished the interior yet. This is the rendering that we had. So last picture I took had 3. Now we have 5. There's going to be 10 here altogether. So we have the first 3 done, and we're really looking forward to it, because when you stand under these things, they're just, they feel like they're alive somehow. They're rather spectacular. I can stop. If anybody, what time is it? What time is it? Enough? Okay, then I'll stop. I'll take some questions. Super. What I didn't show was we're doing a children's museum in El Paso on the border. We just finished a library in Calgary, and we're opening art museum in Omaha, art museum in Iowa, Ford Motor Company. We're redoing their research and engineering platform, and I'm sure I forgot something. Yeah. If anybody can ask a question after that.
For the TR library, how do you account for animals interacting with the buildings, going on the roof and stuff?
Yeah.
Since bison are in large herds.
Yeah.
They saw it on the roof one day.
Yeah, it's planted, and it can take the load. So if a buff bison wants to climb the roof, it's welcome to. There's the national park is nearby, and plenty of people interact with bison, sometimes in a stupid way, so there has to be a lot of signage that says, don't try to pet or feed the bison. But on another level, we're creating places for animals and plants to exist in relation to the building. Yeah.
So, really quick, actually, thank you for for the really thorough presentations of some of the subjects. I think it's great for students to hear like someone tell stories about the work that explain the work, that each move is specific in a way. And I want to get you to speak a little bit more to your technique of storytelling. I think it has something to do with a history, your personal history, which you didn't really talk about, of a while ago, spending a lot of time doing very complicated drawings with artists.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting and potentially kind of sneaky is the way that you kind of oscillate between, or the way that you manage quite a bit of complexity in the projects by resorting to an incredible simplicity, whether it's in diagrams or in a very accessible storytelling manner of presenting projects, which I think has a lot to do with Snøhhetta's success. And I wonder if you would be willing to give away a couple trade secrets in terms of the way you present.
Sure. Well, you're right, absolutely. I always say that one of the architect's gifts has to be making the complicated simple. That's what we get paid for. If we couldn't make the complicated simple, anybody could do it, right? But it's just like, okay, I'm going to make a 3-story building. Well, it's actually more complicated than that. Or, I'm going to even do an addition onto my toilet. That's more complicated than what most people think. So making complicated things simple is kind of something we have to have as a part of our professional skill. The other things that I would say in terms of speaking is trying to find a language that you can share with people. And I think our industry, certainly architecture, is challenged by the idea that somehow, we've gone through a long history of engineers taking over, project managers taking over. Everyone's taken over and kicked the architect out during some decade. And the last round of that, architects were so heavily marginalized, except for the starchitects, who were had the big names, but everyone else was just being pushed around or pushed to the side or, pushed down with their fees and everything. Such that the response by the architectural community was create a language of buzzwords that nobody could understand, even themselves. So we create all these words that we throw out there, and it makes us sound so powerful, but they're not really powerful because nobody else can respond to them. It's not that I don't use complicated words, and when I talk to my colleagues, I'll be a lot more complicated. But when I get into a larger spectrum of the world, you just have to assume that everybody has a base humanity that they're relating to. So bringing it into, and that's not dumbifying everything. It's not making everything stupid. It's just saying, hey, we're in this together. Let's find words that we all understand, and then we'll build on them over time. And we can make more complex words and more complex sentences after we at least get the table set. And I would say another thing I like to tell people when I have taught is try to avoid the first word out of your mouth being I or my. So the possessive pronouns shouldn't be the first thing that you say. It's hard to do because we're all thinking about me and my. But the work is the work. It's not you. The work is here, and you're the person making it, but you're separate. People can love you or hate you, and still, the work is being seen separately. So if you can start with the work, start by saying, here's what it's all about, and I happen to be talking about it, then it also sets up a different kind of frame of mind. It's not, as soon as you say I or me or my, you build an invisible barrier between you and the person you're talking to, and there starts a kind of conflict, especially with people that aren't architects. I guess, I don't know what else. I also say be honest. You should never lie, and if you don't know something, just tell them you don't know. And that's better than pretending you know, which is maybe safe too. Yeah, here first and then back there. Yeah. It was purely coincidence that I wore a Buckeye color.
But a lot of the work that you showed, there's this kind of repeating theme of interstitial spaces between two buildings.
Hmm.
kind of see a lot of these spaces being used also by like, people potentially.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's like just a happy accident or something that is part of your consideration.
Well, it's an interesting and philosophical question because people say, we use the word space all the time, like, oh, it's a space, or it's, this space is an open space. It's like public space. It's like space just gets thrown around. It's one of those words that we just think means something. But in my head, space doesn't exist. It's quite literally a vacuum in space, unless there are objects that it can relate to. So you need some kind of an object, whether it's 2 trees, or 2 buildings, or 2 cars, or 2 people. At a minimum, there needs to be 1, and usually better with 2, and then beyond that, things start to define space. And those things that are defining space are telling you what that space can be or not be. So it is interesting because landscape isn't space either. We, as architects, we think it's space because it's like, well, there's no buildings there. It's got to be space. But it's not. It's terrain. It's things that are forming space as much as it is inside a corridor. And so in that sense, using the word interstitial space is challenging because everything is interstitial at some level. But I would say that it is very important to make sure that you can make a space where you don't want to move. Like where you walk into it or you get into it and you're like, I'm really happy here. I don't need to go anywhere else until I'm ready to leave. You know what I mean? And I noticed this another thing when I sometimes teach or even at my office. People will make something and they'll draw an arrow through it. Like, oh, here's how you get through there. And people do not move in arrows. Like, people move in funny shapes and sometimes they stop. And if we're thinking only in terms of flow, we're not really making places that people like to be in. We're just making places that people need to go from one place to another in. So interstitial can be about standing or sitting, and it can be about moving. I think that answers the question. Yeah, there's one back there. Oh, there. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a constant. You know, it's always funny. There's these subjects that come up all the time. And, you know, the first one usually when you're an architect is parking. Where's the parking? Like, I went to school for, 7 years or whatever, and I've had a 40-year professional career just so I can talk about parking. So what it all comes down to. And homelessness is the other one. It's like, wow, we need to keep these people off of here. What I've said about that space, and I've said it many times, we don't use those features. I mean, obviously, it can be a challenge if everyone sort of creates their entire domestic life around a space that needs to be shared with other people. However, fighting and telling them to go away is a negative means of managing life. What we try to say, and it's been shown to be true, even I didn't show the project in Calgary, if you make a place that's really great, that has all the kinds of things that make you feel good and make you feel connected to other people and make you recognize that you're a part of a larger society, that's number one. People will find another place. I mean, I didn't have a lot of money when I was younger, and I didn't have a place to live. And I think the first time I went to I went up to Harvard to go see Carpenter Center or whatever. I didn't have enough money to stay anywhere, so I had to sleep like under the stairs, sleeping outdoors. And I had to do that a lot when I was younger because I just couldn't afford anything. I wasn't homeless per se, not that my home was particularly nice either. It was just kind of a little small like shack, but I didn't have the choice. And I can tell you, if you do that, spend some time doing that, you start to get into a vibe. You know what's good and what's not good, right? Like, I'd find a stair that was like in the back that had a little under place where nobody really walked by and I could be comfortable, nobody cared, and that's where I would sleep. But if I went to like the amazing things, like where everybody's like, wow, this is incredible, like no, you just wouldn't sleep there. You wouldn't sleep in the middle of the Pantheon. You know, it's too magnificent. So that's the first thing, is making it lively, enjoyable, and respectful. And that's a positive way of managing it. The other thing that I would say that's important is understanding terrain. Again, it's landscape. So 550 Madison project, those are real cliffs. You know, they're like seriously steep. And if you were to lay your sleeping blanket out, you just roll right off. You know, so it's like, it's without having bars and stuff, it kind of, you figure it out. And so we have that on. And then the other one is skateboards. That's the other thing. Like, okay, where is the skateboards are going to be here? And I always find the people that say that are the ones who don't even know what a skateboard is. They just know they don't like them. Like, oh, it's kids on skateboards. We don't want any of that. You know, and I always say to them, you know, just, you got to put your head in the mind of a skateboarder. You know, they like places where they can build up some speed, where there's not like people getting in their way, where they've got, you know, some action that can be had. But if there's a lot of people around, they're going to find another place to go and do their skateboarding, because they can't get the space. So creating life is nothing. Now, by the way, just because I'm saying all these things doesn't mean I think we should get rid of homeless people and skateboards. That's another issue. We need to build proper facilities for people and make proper skateboarding facilities. That's a whole different issue that's separate from having to manage a specific space. When we built the Alexandria Library in Egypt, everybody said, well, we have you know, people starving in the streets. Why do you want to build this library? And I was like, well, number one, building a library is the first step to dealing with, you know, knowledge and getting people out to break out of their socioeconomic platforms. And number two, they're two separate issues. If you said, well, I'm not going to build a library because there's somebody hungry, then not only are those people going to be hungry, you're not going to have a library. So, you know, I get the point. Like, you've got to be careful with how you spend money, but you also need to be, I think, open-minded about how life is complex.
Thank you so much.
All right. Super.